Hey, I thought I would share how I made some of the things my students used in their line making centers. Let's start with this line spinner that my students were using. I had some 10-inch cardboard pizza rounds that I used. I found the center of the cardboard pizza round, then used a little push pin to push a hole into the center, and then I divided the circle up into 8 different sections just by dividing it in half, having it again, and then created some lines to divide it up. And then within each one of those, we'll call them pizza slices, I drew a different kind of line, and I also wrote down the name of the line. That way, when my students flicked the little spinner, they would land on a different kind of line, and then they could use that to draw with. So in this particular center, it was a drawing center that my students used tempera paint sticks, and the other request was that they had to draw their lines in Roy G. Biv or rainbow order. So we're learning both about lines, how to draw them, as well as rainbow order. So once I was finished drawing all of the different lines on the spinner, then I took a brass fastener, and that's what I was using to create the little dial. The dial itself was cut out of tag board. It helps to have a thicker kind of paper like a tag board. That way when the students flick it and spin it, it doesn't just totally crumble. Mine lasted through multiple class uses. So I put a hole punch at the bottom, and then I just attached it with a fastener. I will give you a tip. Make sure to leave some wiggle room so that the spinner spins easily. If you don't leave some wiggle room, then when you flick the spinner, it just won't budge. So that's how I created the little spinners for my students to use in that particular line making center. I'm often asked where I get my cardboard pizza rounds. Just Google restaurant supplier. Don't confuse them with the cake cardboard rounds because those have like a laminate finish and they're difficult to draw and write on. Next step, to make sure that my students understood rainbow order, I cut apart these tempera sticks and then I took out the colors I didn't want my students using. And then to help them keep these in order, I used some of my sticker dots and I just put a little sticker that color coded with the tempera sticks. This seems really finicky and picky and not normally something I would do. But let me tell you, now I know why people do this. My students not only always put all the markers back exactly where they, belonged, but then they also always use the correct color in the right order. So it really helped my younger students who are just now learning Roy G. Biv order. Another line making center I recently shared was one where my students used 1-inch by 2-inch pieces of cardboard, and using the cardboard side with the little squiggle on it, they were printing different kinds of lines. So I made a little sheet for them to use as a guide. So this is how I went about making the sheet. I just used a piece of copy paper, thought of a bunch of different kinds of lines my students could make with the cardboard, printed those out on a piece of paper, let that dry, wrote down the names of the lines, and drew a little square to be the dice that they rolled, and then I copied it and put it in the little sleeves. It helps to put them in those protective sleeves, which you can find at like your dollar store, because the kids are painting and all of my students are using them. It helped to really keep those sleeves a little bit cleaner. Speaking of clean, I also had this tray for my students to put away their cardboard, keeping the clean separate from the dirty. Another table was where my students used dice, which they also used at that previous center, to roll and decide what kind of line they were going to draw. Again, I created this sheet just by using an ink-filled bingo dauber, drew a bunch of different kinds of lines, 6, and then I realized that I could probably draw more, so I took another sheet, drew 6 more, drew the little squares for the dice, wrote down the name of the line to help them learn them, and I made this a double-sided sheet. That way, if a student, for example, rolled a number 2, and they looked on one side of the sheet and they were like, I don't really feel like drawing that one, they could flip it over and have more options. So it was a double-sided sheet. And then lastly, at the cutting table or line cutting table, I will give you a hot tip. Initially, I drew a bunch of different lines on a sheet. And what happened was it took some of my students forever. So you might want to have a variety of these kinds of sheets like this one. That was for kindergarten and first grade. Then I made one with a little bit more lines. That was for second. And then third and fourth had another one with even more lines on them to cut. This is a little glimpse of what my room looked like on Center's Day. If you'd like to see more of it in action, check out the other video on my YouTube channel. But I seated 2 students per 2 tables. So 2 tables had the cutting center. You can see we have glue sticks, scissors, paper to glue it to. This is the dial table where they had the rainbow order. We're using square pieces of paper. These are 11-inch squares of paper. Will ultimately end up framing the works of art with 12-inch squares. So that's why I went ahead and trimmed off an inch. So 2 tables with the dials, seating 4 children total. I had 2 tables for the printing with the cardboard with that little sheet that I created. And there you can see the clean and dirty section for the cardboard. And then for my last table, that was where we used the ink-filled bingo daubers. Again, we had dice. Oh, hot tip about the dice. Keep them in those little spice containers with the window. That way you don't end up losing your dice and the kids can keep track of them. The rattling is a little bit noisy. It's fine. When they were finished, they used a dry erase board to sit, relax, and practice drawing their lines. In 30 minutes, my students were able to rotate to 2 centers. The following art class, they did the other 2. And now we have drying racks filled with all these beautiful works of art that we'll use for collage and different types of things. And my students have created a lot of lines.